Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dollar Dialogue. Today's episode 52, Cocoa, Conflict, and Capital, the economic story of Côte d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast, as the Westerners call it. So, for today's episode, Dollar Dialogue will explore how a nation built on beans and cotton became a battleground for global capital, civil war, and commodity dependency. And what's the true cost behind a chocolate bar? Have you ever thought about that? Behind every silk square of Swiss praline or every Hershey's kiss lies a vast economic web woven through smallholder firms, colonial legacies, military coups, and a global commodity markets. Today at Dollar Dialogue, we won't focus on the politics side of it, but rather economic side, the financial side of it for this episode. So at the heart of all of this sits Côte d'Ivoire, the world's largest producer of cocoa, and a case study in both premise and peril in African development. And in this deep dive episode of Dollar Dialogue, we'll go beyond packaging and into the complex, often turbulent economic narrative of Côte d'Ivoire, from the country's rise as an economic powerhouse in terms of cocoa production to its descent into civil war and its efforts to diversify and stabilize the economy as we unpack the forces shaping West Africa's most dynamic yet fragile economy. So today for our guest speaker, we have Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly. Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly is one of the smartest man, if not the smartest man that I've come across a very long time. Yohann is exceptional when it comes to the themes of aerospace engineering, when it comes to physics, but he's also really exceptional when it comes to public speaking, module UN, and economics. In fact, Yohann was one of the top students at the American International School of Dhaka, where he stayed for 1 year during sophomore year when we met. And Yohann just has amazing insights and intellect to truly shed deep insights and narrative into our podcast today. So, Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly, is there anything else to the introduction that you would like to add before we do a deep dive into Ivory Coast, which is your original hometown, if I'm not mistaken?
Yes, I am of Ivorian descent. You've covered basically all the bases, so yeah, we can go on.
Thank you, Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly. So first segment, we'd like to talk about beans and billions, Côte d'Ivoire's cocoa paradox. So first of all, Côte d'Ivoire, as mentioned before, is world's largest cocoa producer in the world, and simply cocoa makes up around 15% of Côte d'Ivoire's GDP and around 40% of export earnings. But at the same time, more than half the population of Ivory Coast still lives in poverty, and youth unemployment is still sky high. This is something that economists are essentially facing this challenge in Côte d'Ivoire, and today we'll unpack some of it. So Côte d'Ivoire is a remarkable economic paradox. As mentioned before, top world producer in cocoa, yet it is still struggling. Cocoa accounts for 15% of national GDP, and even more strikingly, about 60% of the export revenues. In 2019, if I'm not mistaken, cocoa beans exports were valued at roughly $4 billion, with top buyers including the Netherlands, US, France, and Belgium. Yet this cocoa-driven wealth doesn't translate to broad-based prosperity. Ivorian cocoa farmers typically earn less than $1 to $2 per day, and this is according to, if I'm not mistaken, the African Development Bank, and around 70% of them are smallholder farmers working in unmechanized conditions. So despite this, Côte d'Ivoire has experienced sustained macroeconomic momentum, and this is evidenced by the fact that from 2012 to 2019, real GDP growth averaged 8.2% annually, maintaining nearly 2% growth even during COVID-19 downturn in 2020, one of the few countries in the world. In 2023 to 2025, Côte d'Ivoire averaged around 7%. However, inflation does remain modest. It's not that high, approximately 4% in 2024, compared to West African average of 21.6%. And this is according to the West Africa Weekly, which we also addressed in another episode with another guest speaker named Mr. Jamie Mumba. So youth unemployment is low by regional standards in Côte d'Ivoire, hovering around 5% in 2024, with an overall jobless rate of just 2.4% in 2023. However, underlying this growth is a demographic dividend. Côte d'Ivoire's population reached 31.5 million in mid-2024, with over 70% of its population under 35 years old. Youth aged between 18 to 35 represent 36% of the population, with 38.4% still living below 3.6 $5 per day, under the World Bank's threshold for poverty. The human capital index remains low at 0.38, signaling gaps in health. Additionally, agriculture employs nearly two-thirds of the workforce and is responsible for 60% of export revenues. But its share in GDP has shrunk to 20%, with industry at 26 to 27% and services at 53% plus. Still, about 68% of the labor force remains in subsistence farming, highlighting an uneven productivity and rural dependency. Economic diversification is underway, but still limited. So, with this information about the Cote d'Ivoire Ivorian economy, our question that we received in one of our polls before the podcast to Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly specifically is: could you walk us through the basic economic structure of Cote d'Ivoire on the ground? As someone from there, would you say the youth depend more than just coca? What's driving growth there? How do the youth live over there? And what would you say is the overall zeitgeist or overall vibe the youth of modern day Ivory Coast are facing, economically speaking?
Well, I mean, by all accounts, I'd say it's pretty complicated. As you already stated, a good portion of Ivory Coast's like economic prowess. I think that's probably the wrong word, but like economicness, right? It's mainly in agriculture, but the problem is Ivory Coast is a very urbanized country. Like a good majority of the 31 million people all live in Abidjan, which is not the capital, but it's the main primate city. And you're not going to really get much opportunity to be doing agriculture there. So there is still technically a rural, like, I'm trying to find the right word, like a rural, like necessity, even despite the fact that the country is so urbanized. That kind of presents an issue. What do the people in the cities do? And it's kind of a difficult situation. Some people end up having to go back to their villages. Some people end up going back to farming, but not in Abidjan, of course. I think mostly in Abidjan, it's very service-based. It's very, banking's there. You have like markets. You have people doing small-scale business. So for young people, it's not to say that their prospects are bad or anything, but it's not obviously the best. A lot of jobs, even in the country as a whole, is very government central or it's service based. So, it's kind of hovering around there.
Thank you, Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly, for that very insightful response. And building on that, Mr. Yohaan, how much power do you think local producers actually have in the global value chain of cocoa? Or do you think in Ivory Coast it's mostly multinational buyers like Nestle, Mars, or Barry Callebaut, which are dominating the pricing?
Oh, it's 100% multinational corporations. I mean, like, when you think about it, we are the world's largest exporter of cocoa. And, you'd think that would give us some leveraging power, but of course it doesn't really work that way. Most of that cocoa export is built on, like you said, very, very, very poor farmers that don't have the best equipment, some of which have to even rely on using child labor or very unethical labor policies to meet quotas and do all of that stuff. So yes, I'd say it's multinational companies that have a lot more power than the average farmer.
That's a very insightful response, Yohann. And just building onto that, I see that Mr. Supreeth Nagella has raised his hand. Mr. Supreeth Nagella, is there anything else you would like to add?
Yeah, of course, because like Yohann also mentioned and exemplified, the real money in chocolate isn't in the raw cocoa. It's in branding, because people really don't realize that companies like Lindt, Ferraro, and Hershey make more, like 10 times more, 100 times more from just marketing, packaging, and positioning their product than from the chocolate itself. For instance, take a $3 chocolate bar. On average, the cocoa inside accounts for just 10 cents of that price. So that means the companies paid less than 10 cents to those who actually picked and grew those cocoa beans. And the rest, it's about who controls the brand, the shelf space, and the global image of chocolate. So even if Cote d'Ivoire starts processing more of its own cocoa, making its own chocolate, it realistically wouldn't be able to compete with global brands that have already monopolized consumer trust. So I wanted to ask you, Yohann, how do we get out of this trap? Because you see, over dependence on just one product on over an economy and not being able to use completely those profits. How do you think Cote d'Ivoire should move away from cocoa or possibly use it better to their advantage and uh, grow their economy?
Well, I will mention I'm not a professional economist, so I don't have all the answers on how we can diversify our economy more. And it's not just as cut and dry as just moving away from cocoa. I think, you know, there's a lot of natural resources that Ivory Coast has to its disposal. There's natural gas, there's oil, there's a lot of things that we mine. Then again, it's at a much smaller rate, and given the climate, given like just global happenings, it's probably not the best to switch from one cash crop to like another unrenewable resource. I I don't yeah. It's a hard one because I don't really know what we would pivot to. And maybe more of a focus on I kind of mentioned services were kind of a big thing in the cities, so maybe that, but then it's not really how you get out of a situation like that. If there was like some pathway to making sure that we can hold these multinational companies such as Lint and Nestle, for example, more accountable, and we can more adequately address like the issues of like child labor or like money not actually flowing into the actual people growing the stuff, or less services being given to them. Like I think we need to figure out how to empower the farmers, empower Ivory Coast as a whole to really be able to stand up to these billion, even $1 trillion corporations. But how we go about that is really anyone's guess. You'd have to talk to a more illustrious economist. So.
Thank you, Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly, Mr. Supreeth Nagella. I see Mr. Shazib Karim, your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in as well?
I think Shazib has an internet issue. I'm unable to hear him properly. So
Yeah,
I
me
would like
neither.
to hand the mic back to you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for the discussion, and to move on to the next segment of our podcast, and just to conclude here, we can unequivocally agree that cocoa production in Ivory Coast is something that is not only a regional or internal problem, but it's also something that is heavily influenced by international multinational companies, which are essentially utilizing the cheap labor that Ivory Coast has to sort of profit off of it. And just to briefly talk about it, this also relates to the term opportunity cost. So, as Mr. Spivey, who's our beloved economics teacher, addressed in class, this is one of the biggest issue that majority of the developing countries face. And the opportunity cost is basically there's not proper educational institutions in Ivory Coast or even in West Africa in general for the average person to like go and study. So the literacy rate is pretty low. So the next best alternative for them is to just go and work. And this is the problem that we can see. Like there's like child labor, which is obviously that is very gruesome and that is not very acceptable. But economists, and I was reading this, many economists in journals, they say like the opportunity cost is simply like for them it's just to go and work. And sadly, it's a sad reality for them. But with no access to education, this is what we see in developing countries. Even in Bangladesh, there's like child labor because for them, educational institution is just not possible. So moving on to the next segment, which is the hidden cost of cocoa, labor, land, and legacy. So we have established that Cote d'Ivoire is the world's cocoa giant, responsible for over 40% of global supply. But beyond GDP and export figures, there's another side to the story, one that's harder to quantify. And as I was mentioning before, while cocoa drives billions in revenue, it also comes with heavy human and environmental costs. And young Ivorian uh, boys and girls, specifically in those farming communities, are often the ones living through those contradictions. Let's talk about labor first. An estimated 1.5 million children are involved in cocoa-related labor in Ivory Coast, not only in Ivory Coast but also in Ghana combined. and many of them are performing hazardous work, using machetes, carrying heavy loads, or even applying agrochemicals. Now, despite the fact that I've mentioned opportunity cost, or even despite years of pledges from chocolate giants, labor remains widespread, particularly in rural areas because schools are far and farming is the only livelihood that families have. Then there's the environmental cost, which is equally as important. Cocoa farming has driven mass deforestation. Over 80% of Ivorian forests have been lost since 1960, largely due to cocoa expansion. Forest reserves are shrinking, biodiversity is under threat, and rising temperatures are already affecting bean quality and yields. And because of the farming is done on aging plots, farmers are often forced to clear new land, pushing deeper into protected zones. Add to that the challenge of land ownership. In many rural regions, land is passed down informally. There's no legal ownership of land. So often this comes without proper titles or clear documentation. That leads to conflicts, uncertainty for young farmers, and its limits access to credit or investment. So if you're a young person inheriting a plot, but you can't prove it's legally yours, but it's passed down to you from your family, how do you grow a business? These are some of the questions that economists are facing challenge with. Now, for Dollar Dialogue, we'd like to I would like to ask Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly some questions. So, Yohann, since you're from Ivory Coast, would you say you have experienced deforestation because it's a huge issue tied to cocoa? And are young Ivorians talking about climate change or sustainability, or is it or is it hard to worry about forests when the food is the number one priority?
Well, hmm, wait, sorry. Could you rephrase the question? Let me just internalize it again.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure, no problem, Johan. So as someone from Ivory Coast, would you say deforestation is a huge issue tied to cocoa, or would you say are young Ivorians talking about climate change or sustainability, or yeah, basically, are young people talking about climate change, or are they more worried about putting food on their plate first?
See, that's kind of the thing. It's a big issue, but it's also not one that I feel people talk about enough. There's already like a lot of things, and like we said, we're not going to go into politics on this chat, but there's a lot of other things that people tend to think are more important than the deforestation. And because a lot of people are in the city, they don't really feel a lot of the worst effects of it, even if pollution is getting worse, and quality of life of rural regions is getting worse and worse. Yeah, that's kind of it. And the trend also continues with younger Ivorians too. That being said, I'd have a feeling that when you go to the villages, because I haven't been to any of the villages personally, but I have a feeling when you go to the villages closer to where they're harvesting cocoa and closer to the forests, right? I'd imagine it's probably a slightly bigger issue, but then again, I don't think our government or really anybody's really been addressing it enough, or addressing it as they really should be.
Mr. Supreeth Nagella, would you like to chime in?
Yes, actually, most definitely, because with Cote d'Ivoire, just a pollution and just a smoke and all of that is not that important anymore, because cocoa farming in Cote d'Ivoire is actually becoming a victim of its own environmental impact. Because you see, cocoa trees are extremely sensitive to climate. They need just the right balance, humid but not too wet, warm but not too hot. But because of deforestation, often for cocoa itself, local climates in cocoa growing areas are actually changing. Temperatures are rising, rainfall is becoming unpredictable, and the ecosystems that naturally supported cocoa are collapsing. So, this sort of creates a loop. Farmers cut down forests to grow cocoa. Losing the forest makes the land hotter and drier. Cocoa becomes harder to grow, and farmers move deeper into forests, starting the cycle again. And by 2050, climate change could reduce Cote d'Ivoire's sustainable cocoa growing land by almost half, even though the country is still being pushed to produce more cocoa now. So, a question I wanted to raise is it possible that the real limit on cocoa production won't be market demand, but a collapse of the ecosystems that make cocoa possible in the first place? Because if humidity grows and there are fewer forests, by 2050, we would have half of the cocoa we currently have, and this would inflate the price of chocolates like crazy. So, what are your thoughts on this, Johan?
Well, then my thoughts are just immediately that we really do need to find what our next step is going to be, and we need to do it fast. Not so fast to where our economy like shrinks noticeably because of the lack of cocoa exports, but we need to really figure it out, because if we get into a problem where we can't really even renew the amount of cocoa trees or anything that we needed to actually produce it, then we're going to be in an even worse situation. And then the world's going to be in an even worse situation, because chocolate is a very popular thing across the world. And companies are going to maybe push for stricter quotas, or they'll be a little worse. I don't know. It'll be a lot of trouble. Not that I can foresee, because I obviously I don't know how it'll turn out, but there's definitely the potential for a lot of things to go bad if we don't really figure out what our next step is going to be. And it could come in numerous different forms, hopefully not in other non-very eco-friendly ways, but we need to figure out what we can do.
That's a very insightful response, Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly. I see that Shazib Karim said he's facing internet difficulties as of this moment. So we'll move on. But before that, just touching base on the land rights, what seems to be a big deal in West Africa in general, or even in other parts of the world where there's like not proper land rights defined. So Yohann, would you say land rights is possibly one of the reasons why Ivorian youth are not trying to build something of their own? Because even in Bangladesh there's this thing called informal inheritance, which is basically that since your family has been living in that land for a long time, they like if your father or if your grandfather dies, that you will get it, but it's not legally sound because it's like it's just inherited ancestrally. But because of that, there's a big issue that young Ivorian people are not trying to build, for example, a farm of their own, because land rights are not really defined. So would you say that's one of the barriers which is causing young people in Ivory Coast to not really be entrepreneurial?
I think that certainly has its role in it. Then again, I'm also not very familiar with how, informal land rights work in Ivory Coast. My family doesn't really have any to speak of anymore, but I'm sure that has its place, and I'm sure it's like muddied the waters a bit. I think why young Ivorians aren't entrepreneurial is kind of like a misleading statement, though, because a lot of the sort of entrepreneurial spirit that you can see in Ivory Coast isn't really related to agriculture, but it's more like, a lot of people like have small businesses. They do like markets, they run little restaurants. It's really mainly in that. But yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly, for that very thorough response, and I would wholeheartedly agree with that. So, moving on to the next segment of our podcast, which is Beyond the Beam: how the youth are reimagining Cote d'Ivoire's cocoa economy. So, we have seen both sides of cocoa: the billions that it generates and the burdens that it potentially leaves behind. But this next part of the story is where the things get interesting, because young Ivorians are not just accepting the system; they're reimagining it. And thank you, Yohann, for correcting me that it is somewhat inaccurate or misleading to say that young Ivorians are not entrepreneurial, because I'll try to address that right now. Because Cote d'Ivoire's youth make up 70% of the population, and many of them are no longer content with just growing beans and shipping them out. They're asking why does the value stop at the farm? Why can't we make the chocolate, own the brand, or capture more of the profit? And that is these types of question are fueling a sort of quiet revolution, one rooted in entrepreneurship, education, and value addition. We are seeing that youth-led cooperatives are launching local chocolate brands. We are seeing tech innovators use blockchain to track cocoa sourcing, ensuring fair pricing and transparency. We're also seeing startups offering mobile-based training for farmers, sharing best practices on agroforestry, pesticide safety, and sustainable yield techniques. Even more exciting, local chocolate makers like Instant Chocolate, Le Chocolatier Ivohien, and Choco are starting to gain traction, not just with tourists, but with local consumers, breaking the idea that Ivorian chocolate is only good enough to export raw. And there's also a rising focus on agri-tech. There are recent platforms that I just saw before our podcast today, like We Fly Agri, which are using drones to map farms and help monitor crop health. These are like groundbreaking stuff. Like even in Bangladesh, and we're like pretty dependent in agriculture still to this day, and even we don't have these kind of stuff. So clearly, there are efforts to digitize farming, and others are working to digitize payments for rural farmers who previously worked entirely in cash. And the government has launched support systems like the Youth Employment Agency (AEJ), the National Cocoa and Coffee Council (CNCC), and these type of initiatives are showing that there is this misconception about Ivory Coast that it is lacking. But clearly, we are seeing innovation. Government has stepped in to support training and innovation hubs. But the biggest catalyst is education. We have seen a dramatic increase from vocational centers to entrepreneurship boot camps. And Ivorian youth are learning how to think beyond the plantation, how to brand, how to process, how to market and sell. So, with this sort of information and possibly optimistic information about the Ivorian future, Yohann, you have worked closely with the youth in Ivory Coast during your stay there. So, have you seen any exciting or promising projects there that you would like to share?
See, I kind of wish I had an answer. Not really, but that's, I'm sure, because I'm not in the right circles have really been witnessing that, But yes, I know education is getting better. I know a lot more people are passing what I think. At the end of a high school, all Ivorian students have to, as like a sort of rite of like graduation, they have to pass an exam called the baccalaureate, le bac, as they call it. And I've been noticing that there's been a lot more people overall who's been passing, who've been getting good scores. And, as you kind of mentioned, I've been working with these kids, and kind of what we do is we end up giving them scholarships based on that. So I'm sure it's really showing a good trend in the right direction, that people are doing a lot better with their education. If I knew more people who were in like the more like entrepreneurial side of things, I would let you know, and I can always let you know later. But off the top of my head, I don't really know these people all too well. But that's not to say that we can't be optimistic. I know there have been, as you were talking about, but like I said, I don't really know these people personally, so I can't say much.
Thank you, Yohann, for that answer. And I would say, yeah, off the top of our head, it's pretty hard to come. And other than that, another question that came up in our polls before this podcast is that chocolate is still produced in Europe or even the United States, even though the beans are sourced predominantly from Ivory Coast. So, from your opinion, from an economical standpoint, or even from a financial standpoint, what do you think would it take Côte d'Ivoire to become a global chocolate powerhouse and not just a supplier?
There's like a couple ways you could do it. You could do it like how some other countries kind of like make their exports sort of like luxury. I know Rwanda does this with their coffee. They make theirs like a luxury. I think even Ghana has been taking some forays into this about like luxurizing their stuff. But then above all, I think it would be giving farmers vocational training, giving them like the tools, mechanized tools, making it easier for like local, not corporations, but local companies to come in, have like local ownership of these actual factories, have the people working there have an actual stake in it, so that they can have like actual access to the money that they're making. I think once that happens, specifically once like the money from the cocoa industry comes into the hands of the farmers as much as it should, it'll start like a loop where more people will be more willing to get into it. People will have more of an incentive to be more eco-friendly about it. And, overall, it'll give more power to Ivorians as a whole. I think it'll still help our economy. It'll still probably be a good portion of our economy. The question is making sure that these people who are actually putting in all the work actually have like the fruits of their labor.
Thank you, Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly, for that answer. And I would wholeheartedly agree with the aforementioned response. Mr. Supreeth Nagella, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in as well?
Yeah, I would love to, but did you know that also?
Pardon?
Yeah, I think Mr. Supreeth Nagella is facing internet difficulties. Mr. Supreeth Nagella, can you hear us?
Yes, I hear you. Can you? Me?
Sorry, viewers. I think Mr. Supreet Nagella is currently facing internet difficulties, and Shazak Kareem is obviously disconnected. So this is something that is reoccurring in Bangladesh due to some of the power shortages issues. But I'll hope that Mr. Supreet Nagella and Mr. Shazak Kareem will be able to come back soon. So moving on to the next segment, which is about Ivory Coast and sort of migration and those kind of stuff. So in Africa, we are seeing this kind of stuff where classrooms and crossroads, huge education and migration in Cote d'Ivoire. So far we have talked about cocoa inequality and how young people are creating solutions. But here's a bigger question that cuts all of it: do young Ivorians believe they can build a future at home, or do they have to leave to make it? Because that question is a question that is haunting economists worldwide. It's happening in India, it's happening in Bangladesh, it's even happening in Europe, where in developed countries as well. Brain drain is something that is very prevalent, and economists are not really sure how to properly address it. Let's look at education first. Cote d'Ivoire has made major strides. Primary school enrollment now sits at 95%, and secondary school enrollment has risen to about 59%, and this is according to UNESCO. But there's still a big drop off when it comes to completion rates, especially in rural areas where school facilities are limited, teachers are underpaid, and many kids leave early to help their families farm. Access to tertiary education is even more limited. Less than 9% of Ivorian youth are enrolled in universities or technical institutes. And while the country has respected institutions like Université Felix Hubert Boini or INPHB, spots are limited and funding is tight. As a result, a growing number of students are turning to private schools or trying to study abroad. But here's the tension: getting an education doesn't always guarantee an opportunity. Many graduates still struggle to find stable formal employment. Youth unemployment officially sits below 6%, which is very good, but that doesn't fully capture the reality of underemployment, informal jobs, or even urban survival gigs. So young people face a choice: do I stay or do I leave? Or in French, or in French, if I'm not mistaken, this is translated as est-ce que je pars ou je reste? And pardon my French here, but this is something that I saw very much on social media, where I was researching about this issue. So in recent years, thousands of Ivorians have left for France, Canada, Morocco, and increasingly countries like Turkey and Tunisia. Others risk everything to take migration to Europe or even United States, and they are searching for newer opportunities or even recognition. But here's what's remarkable: even those who leave, many does send money home, and through remittance, this is actually helping Ivorian economy. Even though Bangladesh still leads the world when it comes to the percentage of remittance sent home, Ivory Coast is still up there. So this kind of shows that people does send money home, so they have faith in institutions at Ivory Coast. They do invest in their communities or dream of coming back to build something. And those who say they're still navigating an economy where education is seen as a privilege and migration sometimes as only a reward for it. So I see Mr. Supreet Nagala, your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in?
Yes, thank you for this opportunity to chime in. So, most people don't know this, but Cote d'Ivoire's cocoa market is actually controlled by a small group of powerful local elites and political insiders. They're sometimes called the cocoa barons. So, they work closely with multinational corporations, and they also run opaque cartels that decide who gets export licenses, who gets access to financing, and even who gets to process cocoa domestically. So now here's where it connects to brain drain and universities, because a lot of the best educated Ivorians, economists, agribusiness experts, logistics specialists, they don't just leave for Europe because of better salaries. Some leave because they have no opportunity at home. They have no choice at home, and the system at home is locked. So if you don't have any political connections to the cocoa elite, it's almost impossible to break into the local cocoa business. So the smartest young Ivorians must take their skills elsewhere. And in Cote d'Ivoire, it's also something else interesting is that export licenses for cocoa aren't just handed out based on merit or business skills. They're often handed only to the people with political connections, family ties, and loyalty to those in power. Some government officials and cocoa regulators are secretly involved in the cocoa business themselves, using shell companies or proxies to cash in behind the scenes. There have also been cases where cocoa export taxes or farmer subsidies mysteriously disappear, leaving farmers underpaid while someone at the top gets rich. So, when young Ivorians get degrees in agribusiness or finance, they often run into a wall, not because they're not skilled enough, but because the game is literally rigged. It's not just about working hard, it's about knowing the right people and knowing how and when to pay the right bribes. So I had a question to you, Johan. Uh, can real change happen if the same people controlling the cocoa trade are also controlling the government?
So, like, I'm not going to say I can't legally answer this, but like, I have to very much tiptoe because I mean, these are obviously people in power and, it's kind of a politically tumultuous time. But yeah, generally, I think you kind of do need to stop having like a small group of elites control stuff. I'm
How
not going to
would
say
you
much
do
more
that
about.
as a poor man in Cote d'Ivoire?
Pardon?
How would we do that as a poor man in Cote d'Ivoire?
Yeah, that's a great question. If it has to take like a whole political or social movement to change it, then yeah. Again, I am trying very, 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 very hard to not get political at all. So we're not gonna talk anymore about this. If that's okay, please. Thank
Yes,
you.
Mr. Coulibaly, of course a very valid request, and I will actually agree with you. Dollar Dialogue is based on economics and not politics. Even though we do host a segment called Big Brothers and Their Economies, but that's more political. And here, yes, corruption or stuff like this, it's prevalent everywhere in the world, and Cote d'Ivoire is just another example of it. And obviously, as mentioned before in our podcast, Cote d'Ivoire's economy does seem promising in the sense that government is getting involved, they're supporting, and monopolies, as Supreet brought up, it's something that even in developed countries or even in developing countries, it's sometimes oligopolies as well. These are very prevalent. Even in South Korea, take the chaebols for example. They are like bunch of oligopolies controlling the market. So this is not just Cote d'Ivoire. Big companies eventually, if they have enough market power, they will try to control the market prices, and eventually it's usually two or three companies. And this is seen in South Korea with Samsung and the chaebols, even in Ivory Coast, and even in other parts of the world. So this is not something that I would say is surprising in any way, shape, or form, but it's just a part of how businesses often come to be with eventually with time. So with that being said, Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly, you are since you are Ivorian, but since you are currently living in the United States, would you say there's a Ivorian community in the United States, or would you say do you wish to go back to Ivory Coast to potentially change its future as a policymaker? Do you see that happening?
Well, I mean, even if I wanted to go back to Ivory Coast as a policymaker, I kind of can't. I don't have an Ivorian citizenship. I am Ivorian by descent. My parents can do that. I really can't, though. I
Are
will
you second
say,
generation?
oh yeah, I'm second generation. I was born here in the U.S. But kind of going back to the first part of the question, there is a community here in the U.S. But then again, it's also much smaller than you would find it in the francophone world. Like, for example, there's a lot of Ivorian people in Montreal. There's a lot of Ivorians in Paris and France in general. So you'd not really here. There's like pockets. There's pockets, but most of them aren't really here. But if you're gonna find Ivorians here, you're gonna find them in the DC area where I am. You're gonna find them in New York because I mean that's where everybody who's international is. You'll find a couple of them in the South in some places, but like, yeah. But regardless of good majority of them will still find ways to send money back to the family, sort of regardless of economical status. So I think that's a good thing. But then at a certain point, it's like, what can the government do to be supporting these people as opposed to it just being private citizens to support these people? But that's that. Like I said, that's a different story for a different time.
Thank you, Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly, and yes, that's very inspirational to hear. And what would you say is your personal experience as a second generation Ivorian living in the United States? You have a very like you told me before in the past that you have a very interesting surname. Would you say that in any way, shape, or form has impacted your life?
My last name, just my last name.
Yes, or your name in general, like Yohaan Coulibaly. Like, would you say that has impacted how you live in the live in the United States, or would you say your culture has shaped you in any way, shape, or form? Since you're very multinational, you have lived in Bangladesh, you have lived in U.S., Ivory Coast, then also in the Philippines. Would you say that has shaped you as a person?
Well, I mean, I am a third culture kid at heart, right? I've lived not in every continent, but I've lived in a good majority of the continents. So yeah, pretty clearly it's shaped me. My name in the US, right? I mean, besides just like earmarking the fact that I'm like a second generation immigrant, I mean, it's not like it's used against me per se. I still have my passport. I have my accent, so people will know I'm American. I I don't know. It's kind of a hard question, and that would require a lot of pre-talking about. So like I don't. I mean, yes, it's clearly shaped who I am, but it's like it's a lot. It's a lot. It would be a long story for what I think we only have 10 minutes left. So
Yes, Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly. Yes, that's a very valid point. So, moving on to the next segment of our podcast, which is the ghost in the soil, colonial legacies and cocoa economy. So, to provide some context, back at Wharton, I had met Professor Bakan Mabisi, who was, if I'm not mistaken, she was from, if I'm not mistaken, I think she was from like South Africa or like around that. I forgot the country, but like she was from the southern part of Africa, and told me that in Africa the main problem why economically it's still lagging. In fact, if you speak solely based on continents, Africa's GDP is lower than. And this is obviously not accounting for Antarctica. Africa's GDP, combined GDP countries, is like very like low compared to other parts of the world, and the reason for that is obviously colonial legacies in the cocoa economy. So to close this episode and to like talk about this final segment, we have to step back, and I mean way back, because you can't understand Cote d'Ivoire's cocoa economy or its modern development without looking at the colonial roots that shaped it. So Cote d'Ivoire was a French colony or francophone from 1893 to 1960, and during that time it wasn't just governed, it was engineered for extraction. The French colonial administration introduced forced labor or corvée to build roads, railroads, and plantations. Cocoa wasn't indigenous to the region, it was introduced and expanded under colonial control. Indigenous people were conscripted to work on the land, and the profits flowed outward to France, to European markets, to global networks that Ivorians had no control over. And even after the independence in 1960, the economic model remained extractive. The Ivorian state under Feli Houphouët-Boigny continued to prioritize exports like cocoa and coffee, but the pricing power still sat with foreign buyers and value addition happened abroad. France remained a dominant figure through the CFA franc, a colonial era currency still used in Africa, West Africa, and Central Africa today. While officially tied to stability, critics say that CFA system limits monetary sovereignty and keeps former colonies economically dependent. Even today, major chocolate companies, Nestle, Mars, Mondelez, source billions of dollars worth of raw cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire, but less than 5% of global chocolate is actually produced here. And there's deeper legacy, education systems model after the French lycée, legal systems that prioritize imported frameworks over local realities, and cultural narratives that sometimes equate development with westernizations. These are some of the tough questions that economies have to deal with when talking about West Africa in general. So, with that being said, my question to Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly is, Yohann, how visible do you think colonial legacy still is in Ivorian economics or education today? Would you say you have experienced that during your visits to Ivory Coast?
Well, I mean, je parle français, no? So, yes, France is very deeply entangled in all of this. Again, we're not going to get too deep into this because this is a little sensitive. But yes, a lot of the economy is tied to France. A lot of the services are tied to France. A lot of even like the exports, the imports, it's very all Franco-centric. The education system is mirrored on and based on the French education system. Hell, the back that I was talking about, the high school exam that I was talking about earlier, that's already graded in France, so you can see France has an indelible like fingerprint on damn near all parts of the society. Pardon my language. Uh, I don't really know how we go about fixing it because, to be honest, we're not like a colony per se, but we have a very colonial-ish relationship with France that really needs to be addressed. A lot of politicians are actually, you know what? Let's not even go there. But a lot of money flows from France. A lot of money goes into France. It's a symbiotic relationship, but then like at the same time, people don't really benefit as much as they maybe could, or maybe just not at all from having France be in the loop at all. You know, it's kind of a huge problem with most of West Africa. It's a big problem with La France Afrique, or like the organization of the Francophone or former French colonies in Africa. I always say France was a worse colonizer than England, but we don't have to go there either. But yeah, France is really there, and it's not great. It's not great. Let's leave it at that. It's not great.
Mr. Supreeth Nagella, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in?
Personally, no, because Johan summed everything else up beautifully. So thanks for that.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you, Mr. Supreeth Nagala and Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly. Yohan, one more question that one of our viewers asked in our poll, and I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, it was Mr. Rishan Ali, and he asked, yes, it was Dov, and he asked, do you think there's a need for new economic identity or a new identity in Ivory Coast, one that's not defined by France, or one that's not defined by extraction or dependency?
Well, given our history, I don't think there's any divorcing us entirely from France. That's kind of the nature of it. The question is how far we can distance ourselves from them. And I think we have to do a good deal. It's always possible. It'll take a while, and it'll have to take a lot of deconstruction. We're going to have to get rid of the CFA franc. We're going to have to change a lot of different things. We're going to have to be maybe even more in cahoots with like Burkina Faso and Mali and the other Sahelian countries that have sort of freed themselves from the colonial shackles. Chocolate is kind of another thing, though, because I mean, leaving it completely would be like doing our economy a disservice. But then at the same time, where we are right now isn't really the best for anybody, right? It's not, or anybody isn't any of the citizens here. It's great for Europe and the multinational companies, but it's not great for us. Abandoning it puts us in a bad situation still. So it's really about finding more sustainable ways to like obtain it, sustainable ways of like producing it on our own soil, making sure that the people who are doing it get paid properly, making sure that kids don't have to feel like they have to go back into their family farms as opposed to seeking education. And yeah, I mean, honestly, it does still kind of go back to France. We have to figure out how to get French interests or European interests sort of divorced from all of that. But it'll take a while, obviously, but I think it's possible. We can, and either way, we're going to have to face it before 2050. Otherwise, our economy based on chocolate isn't going to be doing too hot, to say the least.
You're completely right, Johan. I completely agree with you. And while moving beyond cocoa and raw exports is a key piece to the puzzle, it's just a beginning, because there are several steps we need to take to make a transformational journey. First of all, we would need to build local manufacturing ecosystems, because right now Cote d'Ivoire imports too many of the goods we could like they could be producing ourselves, from clothes to construction materials to everyday consumer products. So Cote d'Ivoire needs to build up local manufacturing ecosystems, especially small and medium industries that serve domestic markets. Number two, the trade policies and must be reformed in order to protect local industry, because the reality is without protective measures or subsidies, local businesses can compete with cheap imports. So it's time to rethink the trade agreements, especially those that favor former colonial powers over local industry. So in order to do this, there should Cote d'Ivoire should be creating incentives for companies to source locally and penalizing those that undermine domestic production. This is how you would be able to build economic sovereignty. And the number three, capital for young entrepreneurs must be increased, because a lot of young Ivorians have brilliant business ideas but no access to credit. So, for real financial inclusion is necessary. This means microloans, low interest loans for startups, investment in youth led ventures, and financial literacy training. And finally, we need to embrace the digital economy, because internet access is still very limited in rural areas, and a modern Ivorian identity should be connected digitally, economically, and globally. And in order to do this, the youth must be trained in coding, design, e-commerce, and remote work, because this would not only just reduce unemployment, this would build an identity that can compete on the world stage. But let's be honest, none of this can ever happen without political will. So if you're talking about building a new identity for Cote d'Ivoire, then we must talk about changing how the government works. Right now, too much decision making is centralized with corrupt leaders. Too many leaders are disconnected from the needs of the people and are laundering a lot of money for themselves. And the policies serve the elite, not the majority. So, in order to do this, we need stronger institutions, transparent, accountable, and truly democratic. And in order to achieve such a goal, there is no option other than to build a movement, build a revolution, start a revolution. It might take a decade, it might take a century, but eventually the revolution will succeed, and that's the only way for Cote d'Ivoire to have a successful economy, because by 2050, as Yohann already mentioned, the economy will start shrinking because land is being lost for cocoa, and this would mean that everyone would become poorer. But on another perspective, we could also see that if land starts shrinking and eventually cocoa cannot be produced in Cote d'Ivoire anymore, then the foreign companies that were looting the common man would leave, and that would mean that the government won't really make that much money off of Cote d'Ivoire, and this would mean that eventually the common man, even though will suffer in the short term, might eventually see a regime change. So, what are your thoughts on this, Johan? Yeah, exactly.
Okay, on that last point, as lovely as it would be to think that that would happen, no, I think even if for some reason cocoa was just fully unable to be grown in Ivory Coast, or some of the like other slews of cash crops, or like these like specific resources, oil, gold, aren't able to be harvested, they're gonna find something else. Like I kind of mentioned earlier, there's a lot of intertwining between Europe, specifically France, and the government as a whole. There's like a weird symbiosis there, where France kind of relies on it, and we kind of rely on France on some things, maybe too much. Alas, yeah, it'll take a while. I think, I don't know. I think the best way is that we do what we can to assert ourselves as a fully independent country, where we make our decisions with less like multinationals having a say, or less like foreign governments trying to do other things. And we can try and avoid having a situation where everybody in the country loses, where everybody is doing worse economically. I'm not the biggest trickle down person, but I think even that would maybe help. Having more Ivorian ownership of things, having more Ivorian like production, having all of that, but then also making sure that we are divorced from France as much as possible. Yeah, I don't know. Like you said, it might take centuries, it might take decades. I don't know. But I have faith in my country. I think we're smart people. Not to toot our own horns, we're a very charismatic, lovable people. I think we have a good future. I think it just will take a lot of active divorcing from France and a lot of making sure that everybody in the country can actually feel the effects of cocoa, not just the government or the people with the most amount of money.
Thank you, Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly, for this very deep, heartfelt words. And I would also agree with you over there. So to wrap up our podcast for today, we explored the Cote d'Ivoirian economy. We touched based on how cocoa is heavily intertwined with the Ivorian economy. We also talked about education. We talked about entrepreneurship, how there's an optimistic future that lies ahead. And we also talked about migration, brain drain, and we ended with colonialism. So today was a very insightful and deep, thorough podcast. Even though Mr. Shazia Karim, he was facing internet difficulties, I think we touched based on all of the different segments very, very thoroughly. And to end with it, we can say that colonialism may be on paper, but the imprint is everywhere, in currency, in the supply chain, school curriculum, and the economic rules of the game. But what gives me hope is hearing people like Yohann, who aren't just aware of that history but are working to rewrite it. And because of the future of Côte d'Ivoire's cocoa economy shouldn't be about repeating its past, it should be about ownership, justice, and building systems that Ivorian labor, Ivorian land, and Ivorian leadership should account for. So thank you, Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly, for being here today. It was very insightful and heartfelt to hear you shed light on the Ivorian economy. And personally, as a second generation kid from there, it's very interesting to hear your perspective. So before we depart for today, Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly, is there anything else that you would like to say to the Dollar Dialogue audience or about this podcast before we conclude?
Not much. Thank you guys for having me. It's been a fun one. It's a good hour or something like that. Yeah, hopefully, like I said, things get better for Ivory Coast, and hopefully maybe in the future, once things get better, I can come back and we can reminisce on this and see what's changed and what hasn't and what we can continue to improve on. And I guess tune into their other episodes. Just shout out. Yeah, something like that.
You want to share your Instagram? We'll tell our followers to give you a follow.
Oh, my Instagram.
Yeah.
Type. Okay. Yeah, we can do that. I don't have this on hand. Okay. It's ESKI.ing on Instagram. If you want to follow me there, you can follow me there. Yeah. I don't do much with it, but it's there if you want to keep up.
Thank you, Mr.
Yohann.
Yohann.
Please, guys, go give him a follow. Sorry, Arib.
Yes, no worries, Supreeth. Thank you, Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly, for the amazing shout out and for giving your Instagram out to the public. And I'm sure the Dollar Dialogue viewers will appreciate it very much. So
I hope so.
So this was all for today, viewers. So thank you for watching episode 52, which was about cocoa, conflict, and capital, the economic story of Côte d'Ivoire with Mr. Yohaan Coulibaly. And that's all for today. And that's all for today. Thank you, viewers, and we'll see you next week with another very interesting episode with another very interesting guest speaker.